Thank you. Great to be back. Unfortunately, with a not so great theme. This is again an issue. I remember talking about this, and I think it was Congress 22 or 23 the first time, so in 2004. So unfortunately, we have to go through the process again. Short history, data retention on the EU level first started in by the way, there's a lot of text on these slides. You don't have to read this all. The slides will be available later on. I wouldn't even mention everything which is on there, but the slides are supposed to be used even without the talk. So that's the background why there's so much text on there. So the first time I was confronted with this problem was in '98 with going dark. So law enforcement basically popped up and say, well, with all these internet services, we don't get access to data anymore. They were used to getting access through telecommunication services, more or less any way they wanted to, and they couldn't with internet services. This led to nothing, but after 9/11, data retention was argued as indispensable. So yes, there was a first proposal from France, Ireland, Sweden, and the UK in 2004, and this led in 2006 to the first directive introduced by the EU, which then all the countries were supposed to implement into national law. This directive lasted quite some time before it was abolished by the ECJ, which only happened in April 2014. So 8 years it actually stayed with us. And in 2016 and again in 2022 and 23, the ECJ always reiterated that all the national implementations they will have to be abolished as well, and so on. What happened in Germany? We had our first iteration from 2007 to 2010. So from November 9th, 2007 up until the abolishment by the Verfassungsgericht in 2010, we had data retention, the first iteration in Germany. I had the pleasure of being expert there and helping abolish that. And the second iteration from, the second iteration from 2015 to 2023, that was a rather more lengthy process. Because the Verfassungsgericht didn't initially take the case. So it went through the Oberlandesgericht in Münster, and then they stayed the implementation. So basically we had data retention, but it didn't need to be implemented by the service providers. And that went through the Bundesverwaltungsgericht, and they referred the case to the ECJ. We as ECHO supported this case, so it was brought by SpaceNet and later on also by Deutsche Telekom. On September 20th, 2022, the ECJ ruled that general retention is not acceptable and can only be done for national security and serious crime. So later on then, because of that ruling, the Bundesverfassungsgericht actually took the case and ruled that the German law is non-conformant, it doesn't need to be executed anymore. It stayed in the law until today. It's still in there, in the telecommunication law, but it is not being executed. But it never went away. Like it stayed in the German law, it also stayed in most other jurisdictions in the EU. Just because a directive is abolished doesn't mean that the national implementations will go away or are deleted from the laws. So in 2023, the last survey I found, over 20 jurisdictions still had some form of data retention in the law, both for telecommunication and ECS providers. And a lot of jurisdictions actually amended their existing laws after 2022, after the ECJ ruling, that they became executable again. So meanwhile, and because that will become very important later, there was a shift of service use by individuals. So back in 2001, when this all started to be discussed, over 90% of communication was access provider based. So we're using email, using telephone services, SMS. That was the typical usage, and that was all based on the telecommunication services. In 2024, already 97% of all interpersonal communication was through OTT services. Basically everything from email services, messenger services, social networks, sort of everything was on OTT services. So the provisions for actual service storage became more or less meaningless. Even for the remaining service, which is still telecommunication service based, which is telephony itself, there's still a lot of usage with the telecommunication service providers. They typically store this data a lot longer because they have a legitimate interest because of the billing procedures in the back end. So they can store the data for 3 to 6 months, and that is typically happening. In some jurisdictions, it's even 12 months or more. So even for that, you don't need service-specific storage as in a mandatory data retentions. On the other hand, the services are no longer based nationally. It's typically an international process where law enforcement needs to access a foreign jurisdiction that was historically through multilateral agreements, which is a paper process where you send a translation and order and so on, and then it's nationally executed and the response is sent back to the requesting country. It takes way too long. It takes months to execute. And the retention periods for service data, if there is a retention period, in some jurisdictions there is no limitation at all. For business purposes. So if you can claim that the data actually belongs to you as the service provider, and a lot of, for example, American companies do that, they can basically store it forever. Even the GDPR calls, which say there's limited storage time, are overruled by national laws for data retention. So in Poland we have 5 years, in Italy we even have 6 years, but even in Ireland, which is probably the most relevant one, because most of the service providers, at least the OTT service providers sit there, they have 12 months of data retention. So it's an interesting point, is how, if we have a discussion in Germany about how long is service data retained, what does it mean if over 90% of the communication or the actual interactions are stored in some other jurisdiction where there is actually data retention? Because law enforcement can still access this data under the new regimes I'm going to show you in a second. So workarounds which were tried didn't really work because they were still too slow. So even naming your representative, sending it through the representative and so on, took way too long. What came next was cross-border access to electronic evidence. There is an EU directive and regulation, both, which was passed in 2023, which basically built a fully digital request system for all types of stored data. It's mandatory to register for service providers until August 18th, 26, when it's supposed to go into effect and is supposed to start. Who does it affect? It's the providers of telecommunication and electronic communication services. They are used to doing this stuff because they are bound to work as law enforcement in basically every jurisdiction anyway. But also internet infrastructure providers, so DNS services, registration data, privacy service, proxy service, and so on, they're all supposed to retain and release data now. But who else is addressed by e-evidence? It's information society service providers. What does that mean? It means that basically anyone where there's communication between the users doesn't need to register and release data as well. So that might be shop systems, it might be gaming services. There's also a provision that whoever stores and processes data for customers is supposed to release data. So it could be anyone, all sorts of cloud services and so on, file services, anyone. That's already part. So if data is stored at a service provider, it could be requested by law enforcement from another state within the EU. Deployment model, maybe that's too complicated right now. Basically, there's a national central authority on both sides, which is this green box, e-Codex, and And there's other jurisdiction services which run over this as well. So not just e-evidence, but also whatever parking tickets and exchange of land ownerships and all sorts of stuff. All sorts of services run over e-codex between the member states. And then there will be a national implementation, basically web service for law enforcement and one for service providers. So whoever registers supposedly uses a web service to see if there's any requests they need to answer. Larger service providers can connect through an API and run their own software, which we'll see in a second is also not an easy task. What categories of data are affected? Subscriber data. Basically, all of law enforcement can request that without any special provisions. There's no big security around this. For traffic data and content data, at least it needs it needs to be a serious offense, so it needs to have at least a 3-year maximum sentence, and it actually needs to be signed by a judge. Okay, great. But there's exceptions if the offense is completely cyber-related, so evidence is only there in electronic systems, there's an exception. If it's terrorism-related, if it's CSAM content, it needs to be released anyway, irrespective if there is what the actual levels of prosecution are. There are obviously privacy concerns around it. E-evidence tried to implement protections so that lawyers, priests, members of parliament, and so on, journalists, whoever hold protections, that will be observed and data won't be requested for these individuals. How would some law enforcement from another jurisdiction even know about it? Will they know that someone is a lawyer in another country, that someone is a member of parliament in another country? They don't. And the responsibilities to uphold that provision were never properly assigned. In theory, it's with the country where the individual is located. No, it's not where the individual is located, where the service provider is located. But that even increases the problem. So if you're a user from country A using a service in country B and country C is requesting data, your own country is never involved. So the authorities in country B would need to know that you're a lawyer in country A in order to protect you. It's never going to happen. So the protections are just not there. Some states opposed end-to-end encryption. The service providers asked for end-to-end encryption for all released evidence, and there are some countries which just said, nah, we don't need this. It's a secure system, we don't need this. And digital signatures for everything are required, but they're no longer verifiable for service providers because we lost access to CDB, which is the central database where all the participants are stored. So service providers are not supposed to access this hyper-secret database anymore. We need to supply our information to it. We need to supply our encryption keys and so on to the database, but we can't verify signatures by law enforcement or judges and so on. And some language issues remain as well. AMLET style, translation services are no longer there. It's a complete mess because judges will only sign orders, typically only sign orders in their own language. But what does it help me as a service provider in Germany when I receive a Romanian order or an order from Spain or wherever? What do they actually mean? It's technical terms of jurisdictions and it's technical lawyer terms. Will they be properly translated if I use machine translation? We don't know. So that is a contested area, but there's already that has already been challenged, and some countries actually support the service providers that this needs to be part of the order, that this needs to be in the language of the service provider. But there's more. There's even more problems coming. EU evidence is just within the EU. But there's also the EU Cybercrime Convention, also called the Budapest Convention, which is actually older. It's from 2001. And 81 countries have subscribed to this already. And a further 16 are invited to accede and will be part of the Budapest Convention soon. So there's many EU countries with vastly different legal systems. The way e-evidence was argued is the protections come from us basically, or within the EU basically having at least a common understanding on how protections work. We have the ECJ you can go to if you feel your rights are violated and so on. How does that work if there's 81 countries, and that includes whatever, Japan, the US, but also countries we might feel questionable nowadays, Georgia, Hungary, a lot of countries where we might not feel safe anymore just releasing data to. But under the second additional protocol of Budapest Convention, there's also this changes now, and you can also go directly to service providers and ask them for data. So law enforcement from all these countries can, once it's enacted, it's not enacted right now, it will probably be enacted early 27 or mid 27. Then from all the signatory countries of the second protocol, which is currently 51, they can then also go to service providers and directly ask for data. And it's even broader scope. That could be financial data, administrative services, and so on. So they can go to your tax auditor and things like that. And requests might even be for IP rights violations, which is a big problem, obviously. But there is no provision for a central database at all. So neither is it clear how law enforcement will actually find the right service provider and not address the question to the wrong service provider, which might have a similar name. But it's also unclear on how can service providers actually verify that this is a legitimate law enforcement agency or legitimate judge's signature or something like that. If there's no database, no way to verify it, how can we validate signatures if there is no database and how to do this? And also a contested issue is how do we protect response data? Some countries, especially from Africa, feel that it should be sent as is, not encrypted, nothing. And obviously this is prohibited by GDPR for European service providers. We just can't send data unencrypted, which is pertaining to private individuals. Upcoming, just for completeness, is UN Cybercrime Convention, which was basically brought up because Russia, China, Iran, and these countries were not allowed to join Budapest Convention because their systems are deemed to be incompatible with the fundamental ideas and human rights protections of Budapest Convention. So let's see where that goes. I haven't seen anything on the implementation with service providers so far. So unfortunately, in 2024, we lost a significant battle with the ECJ Hadopi ruling, which is a big problem because what the ECJ said is that they basically separated IP address storage from service provider, from service storage, and that initiated a new push for data retention throughout Europe. A lot of countries and legislators now thought, oh, hey, there is a way we can do this. We can actually have IP address retention, and we can use it for all sorts of crimes, not just for serious crime or national security. And that was supported, unfortunately, the whole idea was supported by von der Leyen's political guidance, which basically asked for, oh, yes, we need data retention, but we will also safeguard fundamental rights, however this is going to happen. And there was a call for evidence and a public consultation in 2025. The principal changes in court position was this clear split of data retention from the service usage retention, and that they explicitly said that the IP address retention alone is no longer considered a serious infringement, which, well, we'll see about that. But the limitations are basically, I'm not going to recite this, is basically everything needs to be separately stored. Service data cannot be overlaid with IP retained address data, at least not by the service provider, and that's good enough, more or less. So what does IP data retention in that context entail? It's basically nothing new, and most importantly, it's not a reduced scope for IP data retention. It was always the case that access providers needed to store IP addresses. That hasn't changed with the timestamp and when was that IP address assigned and how long was it used and so on. No changes there. Increased amount of data, even an increased amount of data is now required with ports and probably IMSIs and things like that, in order to be sure that with the data set given, you can actually identify the user. Right, no flow data is to be stored, so you can't really build a profile on this storage. That is true. but it's still more data than was supposed to be stored before. The time frame has become longer. I'll talk about time frames in a bit. So there is no reduction in anything. So basically, IP data retention has stayed as it was from 2004 onwards, always the same. Other than for the service provider side, we need to store it separately. It needs to be a safe system. It needs to even support safe deletion, whatever that means. And it's now also usable for all sorts of criminal offenses, which is a huge problem because all sorts of criminal offenses can be anything up until, and that's obviously the French position, intellectual property rights, right? So something you would definitely not consider, at least most people would not consider a serious crime, but that is obviously up for discussion on where you are. Then there was the 2025 consultation by the Commission, and also there was a round of questions sent by the presidency to the countries. So the Commission asked first for evidence, basically saying, oh, what can be done with retained data and how does it work and what are the timeframes, what happens there. And then there was a public consultation which went until September. So basically anyone could, and there were thousands of submissions by individuals and privacy rights organizations and so on, which I hate to say are mostly dismissed. They're not seriously looking at it. More interestingly, on November 27th, the presidency offered an insight in what the member states submitted. So the 15 member states who actually submitted something, they basically said, no, we need a minimum of 6 months data, IP data retention, extendable by national laws. Otherwise, they wouldn't be able to compromise on it, because some countries have no retention, some have 6 months, 12 months, up to 6 years. So how do you compromise? Oh, just allow that more as permissible as well. They want access for all sorts of criminal offenses. No news here. And that's the biggie here. Mandatory service level retention for all telecommunication OTT services, but also for DNS, for VPN, for cloud services, file storage, financial services, online shops, gaming, hotel, taxi, food deliveries, and so on. So everyone. Everyone who's offering electronic services would ideally store service data for 6 months plus. So my personal assessment of the country's wish list, and I call it the wet dream list, of course, yeah. But there was never any that more than 4 weeks of data retention does anything meaningful for actually more cases being solved. That was never demonstrated. There's no studies on this. There's even the data released by law enforcement themselves. The statistics tell you there is no meaningful increase after 4 weeks. And most of the processes have streamlined in a way that this works. There are, however, a handful of high-profile cases where through international cooperation, some crime rings are being fought and so on. And it actually takes forever to set up these proceedings, and so they might need data for longer than that. But for general retention, you always argue about the high amount of cases, and not about single and individual cases. You'll always find a case where more time would solve a single case, even after years. Could happen all the time. But that is no grounds for data retention. And obviously, and that's what law enforcement has in mind, right? The envisioned combination of usage data from all these sorts of services, up to your food service, whatever, obviously fails this clear. What the ECJ basically said is that still from the data, yes, IP data can be stored, but again, no profile of an individual should. You couldn't do a profile on the individual from the service data stored at some other location. And this clearly fails this test. If you use all the service data, and then you can actually identify who's behind that through IP address retention, you still have mass surveillance. You can completely look, you have the glass citizen, right? You can look through everything. I mean, this will be an uphill battle for civil society, right? So to demonstrate in front of the courts that several individual legal provisions now lead to mass surveillance is kind of like what we had in this Überwachungsgesamtrechnung discussion in Germany. It will be so difficult to show that through these individual atomized measures, so what law enforcement, or what the states are doing right now is more or less atomizing these individual provisions and then trying to overlay it through automated access even internationally. So yes, law enforcement will have all the access they want, but nationally on the individual cases, they can basically claim it's the individual measures are non-invasive, or at least not as invasive as so that they're not permissible. Which leads us to the reintroduction of data retention in Germany. We have the third iteration now up. The service providers were sent the draft law on the 22nd of December, and we have it for consultation until the 31st of January. And it only calls for IP address assignment retention, no service retention, no general service, not even for telephony. There's no service retention in this anymore. But we need to store ports, location, IMSI, MAC, and so on. But there is something in there which is interesting, which is supposedly only a transposition of what is called an epoch PR. This comes from e-evidence, and it's a preservation order. So if law enforcement cannot produce a proper release order at any given point in time, they can ask for preservation of data. Under e-evidence, this is only data up until this point in time, not forward-looking. The discussion we had in Germany for quick freeze, at least the latest version of this, was also forward-looking. It didn't just freeze data, it was also storing data for the future. What they did now is, under the umbrella of epoch PR, we're basically saying, oh, the German version, we can do it forward-looking as well. And forward-looking, up until now, always required a judge's signature, because that's supposed to be a surveillance measure. Law enforcement can go to the judge, ask for it, before they issue the request. And they can basically go to all service providers now and ask for it, and they don't even need to demonstrate probable cause. They can basically go to the service provider and say, oh, there's a risk here, store it. Do it for any time, 3 months, 6 months. It's not very clear right now. So moving to the more interesting parts for this audience, maybe, the whole procedures are also an invite to side channel attacks. So under e-evidence, we already identified some problems. So any compromised law enforcement account can request all subscriber data from any service provider within the EU. It doesn't matter how it was compromised. If it's a compromised judge or court account, it can even request content data, which means also cloud data. So the whole cloud storage they can request, including also full social media accounts, the complete streams, emails, cloud file storage, and so on. Everything. What does compromised mean? It could be hacked, could be blackmailed, and it can be shockingly cheap to even bribe a judge in certain countries. I mean, this is in any country in the EU, right? It doesn't matter in which country we're talking about. In some countries, I was told by experienced individuals that it can be done even for single-digit thousands of euros figures. So if you can get the cloud storage of your biggest competitor or of your whatever, not so intimate friend for a couple of €1,000, bargain. It's a lot. So this is going to happen, definitely. And the EU has even admitted to that already, because they basically said there are significant problems in the war on drugs because of all the money which is available to organized crime. They're just bribing their way through the police force. So it's happening anyway already. Also, the system stretches to 27 countries. It's about 10,000 plus law enforcement agencies throughout Europe. It's 400,000 service providers, diverse software implementations, And the service provider said, can we do this in a zero trust environment so that nobody trusts each other in this? We were told, no, it's not going to happen. There's also no IDS system, so you won't see if there's abuse going on. But they don't need any of this because the system is secure by design. No, by definition, it's even worse. It's not by design. Design I could live with. But it's secure by definition. It is demonstratedly unsecure, and hacks will happen because a system which extends to thousands of locations, how can you secure that? You can't. There's always ways to even be part of the system, maybe just access the communication lines, maybe compromise the systems. And these systems, because of the web interfaces, are actually open to the internet. They're not separated from the internet. The APIs and the web interfaces are part of the internet. So let's see how that goes. On the Cybercrime Convention, the problems are, sorry, how much time do I have? Okay, I'm good. That even allows for fax transmissions, where it's completely unclear how you send back the digital data. You receive a fax for digital evidence, and then what? And there's no way to verify that the requesting entity is actually a legitimate law enforcement agency, court, or whatever. No provisions for that. It's already happening in the US that doxers are posing as law enforcement to gain access to this type of data. And if you talk to Meta and Google and so on, they say, oh, it's an everyday occurrence. We have that every day, that people are trying to impose, actually saying, oh, we're law enforcement when they aren't. But a similar database is not part of the protocol. There are some third-party services like Codex who offer this service, but they only have a very limited, they have about 60,000 law enforcement agents in there, which they know are legitimate agents, but that what is that on a global scale? It's nothing, right? So we have more than that in Germany. Also no provisions for end-to-end encryption, and no requirement for digital signatures on any orders. Well, okay, and that's where we are. My main issues right now are, we have to learn that this overlay of service provision storage, IP address storage, and access to all these data stored in other jurisdictions, which have way longer storage periods, is the real problem. So why do we discuss a data retention for 3 months in Germany if the service provisions in Ireland is a year? But law enforcement can just access the data stored there, and when you ask for it, you'll have to get back anything which is stored with the service provider. So the service provider doesn't observe what is legal in the requesting country. If, in theory, your law enforcement would have to observe that, basically say, oh, we can't request anything over 3 months, but they're not going to do that. They never did, and they never will. So, questions?
Thank you very much. Klaus Sandefeld. Klaus, by the way, we had a quick look through media.ccc.de. Do you know that this year is your 20th anniversary on Congress?
No, I didn't. No, okay, yeah, thank you.
20. Yeah. If you have questions, please line up on the microphones. I think there is already a question on number 6, please.
Hi, so thank you very much for the talk. I was just wondering, what's the motivation? Like, this is a theme that's recurring since I can remember. Like, what is the lawmakers' end goal, the final plan, the great solution? What problem is this is the fix for? I just don't understand.
Well, that's a very good question, and it has a lot to do with how much crime can be solved. I always use that example where from November 2023 through NECMEC. NECMEC is this CSAM reporting system from the US, right? So where basically content is being reported. We receive ports as well. Before that, we only received IP addresses. as service providers, right? So when you only receive IP addresses because of carrier-net, you can obviously not tell them who used that IP address, even if you receive the request within 24 hours. So we had to hand back 80% of the requests. So after November, so basically 24 and 25, we receive IP addresses and ports, and very quickly. So you can actually tell them in 75, 80, sometimes even higher percent times who is behind that IP address. So everything they ask for, and they use the old statistics, is completely besides the point. And with e-evidence and with that number will increase. So you'll actually be able to solve 90% plus of crime, at least due to the IT address retention. The question really is, what is the end goal? You'll never reach 100%. So at some point we need to set some salvage ratio where we basically say, oh, okay, if we reach 90%, that's okay because that's better in most other phenomenon areas. I don't know if that answers your question, but the idea obviously right now is they're working on statistics where they claim we can only serve 30 to 30% of crime. That is not good enough. We need to reach at least 90%.
But do you think those are doctored?
No, it's not doctored. It's just wrong time frames they're looking at. Technically, we moved along a lot further, and they're just using outdated statistics to justify new laws.
Okay, then microphone 1, please.
Yes, thanks. Which of these regulations or directives that you have been talking about are still up for debate, for a lack of better word, and which ones have already been decided and will be enforced?
Yeah, so the German data retention is obviously still up for debate. It's under consultation right now. What the Commission and the Council did this year will only lead to a new legal proceeding. It's not there yet. It's supposed to be released in January. So a lot of this is new, right? E-evidence is there. This is already under implementation. It will happen. Budapest Convention, second protocol is already there, and it will be implemented. There's no room for debate on this, other than some technical details on how it will actually be done. Data retention in a lot of national jurisdictions is there, as I said, in 20 plus, and it's only increasing, like the one in Germany. So it's only a matter of time, I believe, by at least early 27, all jurisdictions will have some form of data retention reintroduced. That's my personal belief. So there's a lot of stuff going on. Yeah.
Thanks.
Microphone number 4, please.
Hi, thanks for the talk. If I understand that correctly, there is no database to show who has legal lawful authority to ask for data requests. So would it be technically possible to use that as an example and having police station A spying on police station B to show why this is a terrible idea?
That depends a bit on the measure we're talking about. Under e-evidence, so EU e-evidence, that is not possible. Because the database actually exists and is maintained by the Commission. Under the Budapest Convention, this will totally be possible. But I mean, what we're talking about right here is, for example, just consider a case where, under the proposed German law, but if that would become law, German authorities would basically say, "Oh, do data retention, retain something, and we will give you as a Epoch PR style request," right? So, but they never actually do that. But if some other country already requests the data, we'll have to release that data. So even if it will never be able or legally be requested and released in Germany, other countries can request that data. So there might be ways through, at least through cooperation, maybe not spying on each other, but through cooperation of law enforcement, and that happens all the time if they build their international cybercrime solving units, then there's actually a strategic decision right now, where do we place this so we can request most data? That is already happening.
Thank you.
Thank you for the great questions. Unfortunately, time is up. So where can the audience find you after the talk to discuss more questions?
I'm still here. Yeah, I'll be maybe right outside might be the best place, at least initially. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. Another round of applause, please.